All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 32, The Challenges of the 21st Century. We'll be looking at Section 1, The War on Terror. So let's recall last chapter, Chapter 31. We ended with the, Chapter 31, we ended with the 2000 election, which was a very close election. It all came down to the state of Florida, and because the count or the vote tally in Florida was so close, the Supreme Court eventually stepped in and ruled the presidential election for George W. Bush, Republican, who then became the 43rd president of the United States. Now, initially, George Bush had a rather what we might call maybe a tame foreign policy. There were some in the Bush wing that criticized the foreign interventions by President Bill Clinton, but that foreign policy went right out the window when the September 11th attacks occurred on the morning of September 11th, 2001. So if you're not familiar, the September 11th, 2001 was when the organization Al-Qaeda, a terror group led by Osama bin Laden, so we'll call Al-Qaeda a terror organization. So Al-Qaeda hijacked commercial airplanes and flew them, killing all members on board the plane, including the hijackers themselves, into U.S. targets, which included the World Trade Center in New York, a financial building, and the Pentagon, where the U.S. military intelligence is in Washington, D.C. You can see from this map some of the areas circled. The World Trade Centers in New York, Washington, D.C., or the Pentagon was also a target that a plane hit. And then one of the airplanes was hijacked by the passengers on board, and that plane ended up crashing in Pennsylvania, killing everyone on board there as well. And so these attacks on September 11th claimed the lives, according to your textbook, 2,606 Americans, which made it the deadliest attack in the United States since Pearl Harbor. This immediately prompted George W. Bush to declare a war on terror. That is a war on anyone, anywhere, who is maybe sympathetic with terror groups. And what makes the war on terror different than perhaps other wars the United States has participated in is that this is not a war which is declared on a particular country, like maybe World War II or the Korean War. It's not a particular war in a specific geographic area like the Vietnam War. It is a war against sort of all terror ideology in the U.S., outside the U.S., anywhere, anytime, any place. The first, or one of the main, I would say, targets for the United States very early on following the September 11th attacks was the Taliban. This was the government of Afghanistan, which harbored terror groups. And so this very soon became one of the main targets for this war on terror. And this doctrine, or this war on terror, according to President George W. Bush, or the Bush Doctrine, said that preemptive attack was necessary. Right? Preemptive attack. That is, in order to protect the United States, the U.S. has to strike first. And this really was a deviation from most of the other conflicts the United States had participated in, and not only the Bush administration, but a large portion of the American public, especially in the aftermath of September 11th, believed that in order to keep the United States safe, it might require preemptively targeting specific regimes around the world that harbor terrorist organizations or even terrorist organizations themselves. Like we mentioned before, the Taliban in Afghanistan became prime target number one. The U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban, the government, was ousted from power. Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, was captured by U.S. forces. And just to give a little bit of background about Afghanistan, we've actually talked about it previously in a different chapter, and that was in 1979, the Soviet Union attacked. But by 1988, the Soviets had to retreat, and one of the reasons why that retreat was possible was because of a group called the Mujahideen, which were Islamic fighters who really wanted to get rid of the Soviet Union because of their what they called, the Soviets were godless, they were infidels, they had invaded their territory. And the Mujahideen, these Islamic fighters, had U.S. support during the Cold War. It was, by the time you got to 2001, the Cold War had long been over. And it was some of these factions that made up the Taliban government. Once the Soviets were pushed back and forced to retreat from Afghanistan, the United States more or less retreated as well. And some of the issues that organizations like Al-Qaeda had against the United States was, really resentment to U.S. We'll just call occupation in the Middle East, in predominantly Islamic areas, and specifically U.S. support of Israel as well. Now, there had been a number of smaller scale terror attacks against U.S. targets in the decades leading up to 2001, or I would say maybe just in the decade leading up, but the September 11th attacks was the major terror attack that really shifted U.S. foreign policy. Now, this war on terror, the Bush Doctrine, this idea of preemptive attack, also led to the war in Iraq, or Iraq War II. If you recall, the Persian Gulf War in 1991 was by H.W. Bush, that is the dad Bush, Bush Sr., 41 Bush, whatever you want to call him. And the Persian Gulf War was about protecting the country of Kuwait from Saddam Hussein, who was the dictator of Iraq. And in 1991, despite the fact that the United States did push Iraq out of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein was left in power. The reasons for targeting Iraq, why it was in the crosshairs, you might say, of the United States there are a few reasons. I'll just talk about two here. The first one is the push by a certain group of ideologues in the United States and very influential with the Bush Doctrine, and those are neoconservatives. So this is what we might call an ideological group. And they were more or less pro-American intervention. And one of the things that the neoconservatives feared was that Iraq, and specifically Saddam Hussein's, his willingness to kind of balk and reject and stand up and oppose the United States on a global scale would send the wrong message to terrorist groups and terrorist organizations around the world. And so therefore, Saddam Hussein had to go. But probably the most important reason for the war in Iraq, and also the more controversial one, is the claim that by U.S. intelligence that Iraq was producing weapons of mass destruction. So U.S. intelligence claimed, and of course the reason why I put claimed here, Iraq was obtaining, right, weapons of mass destruction. Talking about things like chemical weapons, poison gas, perhaps something like germ warfare, but more specifically, developing nuclear bombs, uranium, plutonium, and acquiring the materials that are necessary to build a weapon of mass destruction. And U.S. intelligence warned the United States that if Iraq did develop this weapon, It could fall into the wrong hands. It could fall into the hands of a group like Al-Qaeda, which would detonate it in a major U.S. city. With this intelligence, George W. Bush went in front of the American public, said more or less that the United States needed to attack Iraq, and the U.S. couldn't wait for a mushroom cloud, and that was kind of the visual image that American audiences were given. In other words, we, the United States, need to attack right now. We can't wait for a mushroom cloud to go off in a major American city, causing the deaths of millions of people. The United Nations really pushed back against Bush and the Bush administration, wanted to investigate more, wanted to give Saddam Hussein a little bit more time to comply with UN sanctions, that is, rules to not develop these weapons, to not obtain things like plutonium and uranium and other materials that were required. However, with a coalition of the willing, right, which meant nations that were willing to back the United States in regime change in Iraq, this is 2003. So countries like, Great Britain, France, Russia, a lot of these nations were torn on it. So, for example, Great Britain was part of the coalition of the willing, whereas France, which was, a vital Cold War and World War II ally, was one of these nations who really wanted to have further inspections and to delay or even not even have an invasion if possible. The war itself is referred to Operation Iraqi Freedom. Saddam Hussein was ousted from power relatively quickly. He then went into hiding. It took some months or some years later before Saddam Hussein was captured by the United States and therefore executed for crimes against humanity. Now, he certainly was a dictator, but the reason initially why the United States got involved was weapons of mass destruction. And of course, the most controversial part to this conflict was that at the end of the day, no weapons were found, right? At least not the type that were being reported by U.S. intelligence sources. The capital city of Baghdad quickly fell. So this is the capital of Iraq, captured by U.S. Fell very quickly. The United States claimed victory very early on in the war. The U.S. military was, as some put it, shocked and awed the world. Iraq was not a second-rate military power. Iraq had one of, a pretty decent and strong military, and the fact that the United States achieved the military victory so quickly and so swiftly really was kind of a, there's something to be said about the power of the U.S. military in this post-Cold War era. However, even though the capture of the capital city of Baghdad and the execution of Saddam Hussein was very quickly and was very quickly called a success, the ensuing occupation was much longer and much bloodier. And in some way, shape, or form, the United States is still sort of involved in Iraq even today. More Americans were killed in the occupation of Iraq than were in the initial attack. At home, in order to combat or fight this war on terror, the United States needed new tools and new weapons. The Department of Homeland Security, which you see in this image here, coordinated agencies. So this was created, right? This didn't exist before September 11th, right? This was created as a result of the September 11th attacks, and it coordinated agencies to protect the U.S. The Patriot Act gave, not just the Department of Homeland Security, we'll say it gave agencies more tools to combat terror. One example is the NSA, or National Security Agency, which maybe used things like obtained information, we'll say that, obtained info in order to capture terror suspects. And again, remember the nature of the war on terror is that terrorists could be anywhere at any place. And so it's necessary for the NSA to even obtain information from American citizens. And this was later on exposed by Edward Snowden as being a program of mass surveillance, keeping track and recording all Americans, phone conversations and phone and emails. And there's been a lot of questions about its constitutionality. All right, that is, to what degree does the government have a right to sift through a person's emails or sift through a person's phone records without a warrant in the name of stopping terrorism? And this, of course, has become a big debate in the United States since that time. One last tool that the United States used to fight this global war on terror, Guantanamo Bay. This was a prison in Cuba where suspects are either interrogated or you could say tortured, and the treatment of those prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, like the NSA, like the Patriot Act, of course, also sparked a lot of debate and a lot of controversy in the United States following the September 11th attacks.